Welcome to Conversations Insight. My name is Manyonyi Amalemba.
And my name is James B.
We're here to introduce new programs on AIL TV about topics that affect our community. So for the next few weeks or months, to be exact, we're going to be looking into subjects that most people dare not discuss.
And we shall be looking at these topics also economically, politically, and socially, and also the impact that it has had on our lives today and the future. Today we will be looking at the topic of where we are.
The present.
Mm-hmm. And we shall be looking at the background and the context of how we got to where we are.
And then at a later date, we're going to have some discussions on how we address some of the themes and some of the problems, or how we get solutions to some of the problems that we encounter on the way.
But to look at the present, we shall be reflecting on the past as to how we got here in the first place. Mm-hmm. And with that, hopefully we can come to some solutions.
So for today's program, we're going to be looking at where we are at the moment. Present day in London, in the UK. Where is the black community as it is today? James?
Yes, to do that, I think what we need to do is to look at the background, the context of us as black people, African and Caribbean communities here in the UK, because the immigration and the explosion of our population started in the 50s and 60s. So it would be good to look at the driving force and what drove both of us, and explore the social and the economic reasons why we came here. Because I think that would inform us about our present situations.
So effectively, are we doing better than the people in the 60s or the 50s? Have it changed? Has the landscape changed? We've learned anything from our past, or are we still repeating the same mistakes that we did before? Or are they mistakes, or is it a learned mistake? This is the area that we are interested in how we interact socially, how we interact with the wider community economically, and how we get on together as people.
Yes, and even in the context of business, the way that we relate to each other, on a social level, also on a business level, on a political level, because I think that all those strands are equally important, and how we are, and the question could be asked as to how we really capitalize on our strengths that we have, rather than the weaknesses that is normally focused upon. But these things are meant to be explored. We're not here to enforce a particular opinion, because we're here to explore and we're here to learn.
So, if we go to the coming,
yes,
how did we get here? We're going to concentrate more on the economic immigration, and the 50s and the 60s, when people came here from the diaspora as well as from the continent.
Yes.
So we're going to do a comparison between the two groups of people coming into this community.
Yes.
So, and I use the word community advisedly, because common unity is something that we feel is questionable. Do we have a community as such? Or are we individualistic? Or do we have smaller little communities within communities?
Yeah, pockets of communities.
Are we looking at it from a minority point of view? A minority within a minority? So those are the areas we want to discuss today, and to see what made people leave their lovely sunny islands and lovely countries to end up here.
And to do that, we've got to put it into context.
Yes.
So you're going to start with perhaps looking at the African experience in this regard.
Yes. if we take, let's say, the 50s, or even the 40s, as it were, after the Second World War, a lot of our people did help. They did come here and take part in the war. The next group of people were actually recruited to come and work in this country. But from my experience, most people who came from the continent came here to study. A lot of them came through the government-sponsored college. It was lessons. The government, the colonial government, wanted them to learn the way to govern themselves. But even that one, I'm not too sure. To govern themselves or to govern on behalf of the colonial government. So the people I knew, my father's age group, they would be in their 80s now, if they were still alive. But most of them came here to study. There were little colleges, little administration courses, every 6 months here, a year there. And then there was another group of people who actually came here to do academic studies. There were doctors, there were lawyers, there were historians, people who went to Cambridge University, people who went to London School of Economics, one of the most famous schools that most of our leaders came from. So, were we being prepared to run our own countries, or were we being prepared to run our countries on behalf of the colonial power? Because on the horizon, we did not see the word independence being mentioned. The earlier part of Africans coming here went back to help build the economy at home, but on whose behalf?
Yeah. Well, just to put into context, the Caribbean experiences, I would say, somewhat similar in some contexts, because obviously, particularly because there were different European powers obviously operating there, perhaps starting with the enslavement of Africans and then translating into colonization. And after the war, in the 1940s, and during the war, lots of people from the Caribbean area did come over in the West Indian Regiment, and they fought on behalf, of you. I will go as far to say from the First World War, but because we're focusing on recent mass migration here to the UK, a lot of the Caribbean people came here because of the state of poverty that was there, because obviously, as you mentioned, it was set up obviously to support European economic progress.
Yes,
so
yes.
it didn't have the people there, or the black people there were not of importance only in terms of supplying labour.
Yes.
So the poverty there was so stark. And obviously, the UK power or Europe, so to speak, they exploited a gap there in terms of, obviously, because they could have paid them much less.
But
and a lot of the people that came were actually unskilled as well. I mean, you mentioned about African coming to study, but the Caribbean, that was a much smaller proportion of us came, and that was obviously funded by the government. But a huge wave come from the underbelly of these populations in the Caribbean, coming to service the London Underground and the factories. And in some case, a lot of people came on their own, but they were recruiting stations throughout the Caribbean, recruiting people to come here to work. And the context was, you're coming to mother country. So they were brought up in the whole idea hasn't been taught about coming to the mother country, because Africa wasn't certainly seen as a mother country. The UK was. And that kind of propelled them to think, yeah, we are going to serve Great Britain, and they felt indelibly proud coming to serve the mother country, as they saw it.
But why you said earlier on in your discourse, you talked about unskilled. But they were not unskilled, actually. Most of the people, from what I've read, were actually either carpenters or mechanics, or at home in the islands. Most of them were working during that time. After the World War, a lot of skilled people had been trained to fly. There were mechanics who could repair airplanes. There were people who did cars. So what I'm looking at more from the diaspora is people who went back after Second World War, and then were recruited to come and work in England. They were willing to.
There were quite a substantial number, particularly Jamaica, the case in point, where were a substantial number of the people who fought and were trained mechanics and engineering, and they came back to the UK in small numbers. But if you're looking at the mass immigration when it really started from 1948 onwards, when it really grew, where it had social and cultural impact here in the UK, is what I wanted to focus on. When the dynamics really change is when the numbers are increased.
Okay, let's leave it there for now, and we'll talk about them being when they got here. And what happened when they got here.
Now we are here. Now we've arrived. However we got here, whether we came as students or whether we came as just workers or skill or unskilled,
or the Windrush.
Or the Windrush.
Yes.
But we are here.
Yes.
And we want to look at what happened once we get here.
Absolutely. So we're looking at the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah.
So the people who came in after World War II were actually recruited. They sent ministers to the islands to go and recruit people to come and work here. They were told there were jobs. They could come and help the mother country recover from the war. And everybody was, queuing up to come to work here because, as James alluded to earlier, the islands were in dire strife economically. The production of sugar had gone down. There was no money coming in. There were no jobs going out. People had to leave to go and work in America, Panama Canal, in Venezuela. So a chance to come and work here was like godsend.
Definitely.
So when they get here, in this cold place, what do they find, James?
Well, my recollection, particularly from because obviously my dad and my mum came here, and those, the stories that they regaled to me. First of all, my dad said when he got here, it wasn't. In terms of the physical environment, was the biggest disappointment to begin with, because you're coming from a place where there's sunshine and there's food, everybody's vibrant, to a place where dull, almost depressing. So that in itself did not. It seems to be almost a foreboding of what was to come. But he said obviously the jobs were plentiful. There were housings, some were in warehouses, some were put in different types of accommodation. But though the jobs were plentiful, the way in which they were treated by the general population was actually a shocker for most of them, and they couldn't quite get over that. I remember my mum saying, before I move on, that they were being Christians and all in, serving the same God, and we all going to heaven together. And they went to church on Sunday, and they welcomed them. And after the church, the Reverend said, "Oh, it was good. It was nice to have you here. It was brilliant. We're glad you came, but I'm afraid I prefer if you didn't come back because the parishioners are offended. So please don't come back." So that shock alone, in terms of the religious side of it, where we're all God's children, that's when it become a stark reality. Well, quite actually, we're not quite all God's children, are we? That begins to dawn on them, the shock of even getting over that.
Different levels of God.
Different levels of God, definitely.
So where I'm looking at this is there's a lady who came from St. Lucia, and she said the welcoming. The weather was not welcoming, and the people were even more less welcoming than the weather. And then the government that had invited them actually became a barrier rather than a support for them. So they had to go looking for things. This phrase comes, labor exchange, which is what the employment office used to be those days. So I'm looking at people leaving families because they didn't travel as families.
No.
People came here as grown-ups looking for work. So those who could get into work got work. Those who wanted to learn how to drive a bus drove buses. Those who went on the tube and drove the tubes. Those who worked in factories in the Midlands worked in the factories. And we've got a big contingent of nursing, the National Health Service, that people got in and started working in there. There's a group that's always forgotten when we have these discussions. There was also people who discovered that people liked the music.
Yes.
The music scene in the UK was bereft of life. Right? And these people coming from the sunny side, bringing their lovely calypso and their ska, and they jumped, even though they were in such dire straits at home, accommodation-wise, they still found time for socializing. So the social side seemed to have uplifted them.
Because I'm glad that you mentioned the accommodation, because that in itself was a case in point where, in terms of housing, because people were, in some cases, you later on, as the numbers increase, you would have sometimes 3 or 5, 6 families in a house, in some cases. And my dad said, where they would sometimes share the landing, and you have to wait until one person is finished. Yeah. And something, the conditions were so harrowing that you would not even... They were not fit for human habitation.
But remember, define family at the time.
Well, what I'm saying is that they would. Well, family in the context of that, they were more like couples, really. Yes. And when I say family, because there were times when a child came along. Mm-hmm. Because if a couple is together, they're going to make children, and a couple came along. So families would be there. Initially, when they started, it would be just the men, and then they bring the women along, but they would be all in there. Then a child comes along, and sometimes there were 2 or 3 families in there from here. Not the ones, obviously, that they left, not to think, but the ones they left behind.
So let's look at how do they cope with the situation as it grew. Everything outside them is pressure.
Yeah. And remember, as you said, as you mentioned, that they're not getting the support either from the society in general or the government that encourage them to come here.
And this lady from, I go back a little bit, this lady from St. Lucia said the thing was, when they found there was so much trouble going on, they wanted to go back home. But it wasn't as if you could sort of jump on a bus and go back. You travel for how many weeks? 10 to 13 weeks in some cases on the sea to come here. So a lot of them had to make do with what they found. It was an energy that grew socially and spiritually. Yeah. So how did they maintain to survive? Yeah. They had to do something. Something had to change for them to continue living. So what was it, do you think, galvanized our people so that they survived the 60s? Because according to a lot of them, it was harrowing.
I think that in my view, a lot of things would have propelled them to survive here, because I think it's also, you have to bring an element of the human spirit as well. Yes. And these are people who also endure a horrid time in our history. Mm-hmm. And you could ask the question, well, how did they survive that 500 years? Yes. So coming here would probably be like, nothing really, because to think of that period was probably 10 times horrific. So you could put that into context and say that fortitude was already built in in some context, because they survived 500 years of that, and here it's a dwaddle. I mean, some context, even though it's harrowing, obviously, if you put it in proportion, I think that the spirit of surviving that 500 years, probably, I think a part of that would have, because the human spirit has got this an inalienable way in which it survives, and adapt to situations. But I think they use, to be more precise, I think a lot of them use they use their culture. I think a lot of it, the sense of community as to how proud they were of where they come from, despite being deculturized in some way. They had to find pride in who they were. So
socially
they saw themselves.
They made their own livelihood.
Yeah, they had to create that.
They had to create it from zero.
Exactly.
Because you're troubled, you gel together and come together because you need to get on.
And you know that in many respects, even though the Caribbean islands did commute and exchange, between each other during that period, of enslavement and colonization, for the most part, the general populations never actually interact with each other.
Yes.
But once they hit it, really, the islandism in some respect kind of dissipate, because they realize our back is against the wall now. So we haven't got time to be thinking about, because I remember a story of my dad saying that it didn't matter where you came from. Everybody see a black person, they wanted to talk. They didn't care where you come from. It didn't really matter, because we're all on the same cush. So that sense of community had to be enforced.
So I've heard people living together, people managing together, people helping each other with childcare. You had the partner system, Susu,
exactly,
which got together some money, so they started getting their own properties and buying and surviving and becoming a community as such. The African side, we had West Africa, we had East Africans, we had everybody came together at that time politically, because things were going on out there that were changing life in general. But that's the 60s. So we move forward to where we are at present. What those children who were born in the 60s, that's us, and maybe before, who are now living in this country as citizens. That will be the next part that we look at.
Yes.
There were riots earlier on in the 60s and in the 50s, but we'll touch on those later. Right now, we're just looking at the progression to where we are now. So we have to fill in a little bit of how we got here in the first place.
Yes.
So now, we finished with a sense of community that our fathers and our mothers had during their time. They had to have it. Otherwise, survival would have been impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still see it in existence now, or has it dissipated? Where do we see our communities as they are now?
I think that is a very good point there, Sam. I think that having been gone through our experience and our expectations, and because of the way that we were treated and the hostility we face in the UK, we kind of gelled together in the community spirit, almost in a very imaginary way, because, like you said, we had to do it. I think as people, I think the economic angle will come in here, because as individuals in the community began to buy their houses and progress began to seep in, there seems to be, in my view, an impact on wanting this sense of community anymore, because the way a lot of people saw it was that, well, we don't need that anymore now, because there was incremental progress here. I've got my house, I've got this, my children, whatever.
We have arrived.
So we've arrived in some respects, so I don't really need that. So I think that people begin to see themselves different once they begin to get a taste of British success, so to speak, in terms of material success, so to speak, and also educational success. The community began to fracture, and then there was a time when you had the Caribbean community, arms in arms, fighting racism, fighting fascism, fighting everything. Then as the progress come and the government began to respond with lots of different programs and so forth, you find that when the progress came, then you had the islandism begin to raise its head. Then the Jamaicans who want to assert the Jamaicans, the Bajans, the Trinidadians, and then the insularity really come to bear. And the onset of independence also reinforced that as well. Because don't forget, when they came, they were still under British rule. But when the independence asserted itself, that too had a certain impact on that as well.
But as you say, did the islandism begin to separate the groups in a way that they were patriotic, nationalistic, or is it just, I come from that island, because why are they going back? They're still here.
But I mean, there were two schools of thought begin to emerge from what I see. There were those who were here working, raising a family, and they said, you alluded to it earlier on, I'm going to raise my family and thing, and then I'm going back to my country. The whole idea was about going back. But there were those who said, well, I spend my life here. Yeah. I pay my taxes here. Therefore, you don't know that I'm not going anywhere. So then you had almost two to communities. But you alluded to the fact as to whether the islandism, as I'm going to call it, or that insularity, was there, or right from nowhere, or whether people were just reinstating or reinforcing where they came from, or whether it gave rise to the progress. I think it might be a bit of both, because before I mentioned about the unity was there, and that people didn't really put too much emphasis on that. Really, it was about, because we were facing a common enemy. Whether you were from Barbados or Trinidad, didn't really matter.
It's the same person.
We have to, because when you walked on the road, they're not asking what island you're from. You're just black.
Yeah,
So that was influenced.
Why I went down that road was because I'm looking at the youngsters of now, today
where we are now.
Looking at even their older brothers who are now fathers and children and mothers themselves, the second generation kind of thing going on. What I'm seeing is as if that culture was not passed on to the next generation. It's as if we fought for this and we fought for that, and now we are comfortable. Now you guys don't need to do that.
Yeah, but I find that
where is the radicalness?
Yeah, because it's kind of it's quite ironic in that this said generation fought racism tooth and nail, but yet when it come to in lots of respect, when it comes to the first generation that was born here. They saw them. They said, "You're British. You belong here."
Yeah.
So we don't want to burden you with our sense of history. In some respect, they don't want to talk about it. When you ask about what white man, I don't want to talk about that.
You're here now.
You're here now. That's the past. Why do we need to go there?
We did it for you.
We did it for you too.
You can get on.
But I thought, even though that it I think they thought in their mind that they were protecting them and they want them to expose them to the horrors.
Agree.
And obviously, who wants to pass a history like that on to the children? But in some respect, it also, I think, undermined in terms of the future, the confidence that these young people would have. Because if you're not telling them about your own social history, you're not connecting them with their own social history.
So there's self-esteem, self-confidence.
Isn't there?
The ownership of self as a black person. In fact, a lot of youngsters don't talk of racism. The schools are teaching about racism being the other way. It's black people who are
more racist
than the others.
Yeah.
But what I'm looking at more is life began to change because the second generation felt they belonged here.
Yeah.
And they started, some of the older ones were looking back as their parents, they started visiting the islands.
Yeah.
Remember, some people did not go back to visit. They didn't have the wherewithal. They were not earning enough money to be traveling across the seas to come back.
Yes.
So they were working full time. So there was a disconnect even at the social level.
Yeah.
So everything I hear now is people talking about Sunday lunch.
Yes.
And say, and
McDonald's.
What's the rest of it? What's the rest of it?
Yes.
Jamaica's become synonymous with rice and peas, but so do the other islands do rice and peas.
Right.
Jerk chicken is all over the place.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, where is it leading to that this constant battle between I am so-and-so and I'm from so-and-so? Where is it leading the youngsters? Because they don't identify with any of that.
Well, I think that
they're more British or English than their parents who've been here for 15, 16 years.
I think you mentioned the first generation, but I think that the first generation Caribbean people, they were caught between both. Because you had, they've been culturalized with a British mindset, but there were also hostility to them being here. So a lot of them were caught between the two. So they would assert where they came from, and they would try to even take on the culture, everything, and that's what they saw themselves. And because they were so spurned and rejected by society here in general, they felt more comfortable in the arms of where their parents came from. So I will identify with that. But a lot of them have learned, and going back, that they were quickly reminded that they were actually English. So that kind of a
foreigner
begin to tip the scales a little bit, and they come to realize that there had to be probably a new existence here
Okay, now you've encapsulated the diaspora and the Caribbean experience.
Yeah.
Now, if I put in the African experience, where a lot of the people who came in the 60s and 70s and the 80s up to present day
Yeah.
have come not out of choice, not out of invitation, but because of things happening in their countries. We're looking
Wars
at
and
a
stuff.
refugee culture from the 60s coming to the 70s and the 80s. So the African experience is totally different in general.
Mhm.
I'm not saying all of them, in London or the UK. So we got to look into those things when we are doing a comparative study,
Yeah.
discourse of this,
Right.
because the experiences are totally different.
But how does that inform the African experience? Because you mentioned the refugee culture, you mentioned the different dynamics. How does that inform the?
Because they didn't see colonialism. They only they've grown up knowing a black government. They've grown up knowing wars, civil wars, intergenerational wars that have come during the 60s, coups in Nigeria, Ghana, peaceful Ghana as you see it now, Kenya in the 60s with upheavals left, right and center, Tanzania with revolutions coming and rebellions coming, Ethiopia going through it. So it was across. People are vying for positions. So a lot of people are displaced people. So they had no time. This I'm talking about now, where the interaction is a bit sparse because of those kinds of experience. Because I'm coming here with my troubles. I don't have time to listen to your troubles. And yet the people who've lived here say, we paved the way for you. No, they've come here through a very different route altogether. And they do not see the history in the same perspective as an island person. That's the only thing I'll bring out on the African perspective. But we'll do a comparative next time.
Yeah.
For now, let's finish it there, and the next program will be dealing with what affected, what made this happen in the first place.
That is reflecting on the past.
Yep.
If you're watching Conversations Insight, we want you to be part of the conversation. So you can get in contact with us on several ways: by Facebook, Twitter, email, or website. So that information will be on the screen.
We'll be talking a bit more about that, and please feel free to get in touch with us with that information that you'll be seeing running across the bottom of the screen. Until the next time, thank you.
Thank you.